What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my fantasy football starts and sits for NFL Week 8.
Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon.
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over each position and give you my fantasy football starts and sits for NFL this week. This should help you decide who you want to start in your season-long fantasy football leagues. And we will show you how to use the Draft Dashboard tools to dominate your season-long fantasy leagues. You can find waiver wire targets, get player point projections, find the best positional matchups to see who is projected to score the most fantasy points this week. These tools will help you decide what players to start in your fantasy football leagues. We have it all right here, so let's get into it. Okay guys, let's take a look at my starts and sits for NFL Week 8. So at the quarterback position, I'm going to start Justin Herbert from the LA Chargers playing the Denver Broncos, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they give up the 10th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Justin Herbert has averaged 27.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5 rush attempts per game. He scored 42, 27, and 24 fantasy points in the last 3 weeks, and he got 9 rush attempts last week. He's projected at 19.7 fantasy points here in Week 8. He's $6,900 DraftKings salary and $800 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 44.5 points scored in this game, with the Chargers favored by 1.5. So I like the rushing floor that Justin Herbert gives you. This guy's been on fire. He's got a good matchup. So I'm going to start Justin Herbert here versus the Denver Broncos. Another quarterback I'm going to start is Joe Burrow from the Cincinnati Bengals playing the Tennessee Titans, who have the 10th worst defense overall, and they're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing quarterbacks. Joe Burrow has averaged 22 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 4.6 rush attempts per game. He scored 39 fantasy points last game. He had 6 rush attempts. He's projected at 19.4 fantasy points here in Week 8. He's $6,200 DraftKings salary and $1,400 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks this is going to be a high-scoring game, 55 points scored in this game, with the Cincinnati Bengals trailing by 4. So you have a pretty good matchup here in a high-scoring game and a passing game script. So I'm going to start Joe Burrow here versus the Tennessee Titans. Another quarterback I'm going to start is Derek Carr from the Las Vegas Raiders playing the Cleveland Browns, who have the 7th worst defense overall, and they give up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Derek Carr has averaged 21.1 fantasy points per game on the season. He's getting an average of 2.5 rush attempts per game, and he scored 20, 28, and 24 fantasy points in the last 3 games, projected at 16.9 fantasy points here in Week 8. I think that projection is a little bit low. This is a good matchup, and Derek Carr has been playing really good football this year. He's only $5,500 DraftKings salary and $1,800 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks this is going to be a high-scoring game, 55.5 points scored in this game, with the Raiders trailing by 3.5. So you got a great matchup, a high-scoring game, and a passing game script. So I like Derek Carr here versus the Cleveland Browns. Okay, who are we going to sit at the quarterback position? I'm going to sit Cam Newton from the New England Patriots playing the Buffalo Bills, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing quarterbacks. Cam Newton has averaged 20 fantasy points per game on the season. He's getting an average of 10 rush attempts per game, but it looks like the Patriots' offense has been falling apart. He only scored 3 fantasy points last game. Although he is projected at 20 fantasy points here in Week 8, I don't trust Cam Newton and that New England offense. He's 5,700 DraftKings salary and 1,700 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks this is going to be a low-scoring game, 44 points scored in this game, with the New England Patriots trailing by 4. So I'm going to sit Cam Newton here versus the Buffalo Bills. Okay, let's take a look at the running back position. I'm going to start Kareem Hunt from the Cleveland Browns playing the Las Vegas Raiders, who have the 6th worst defense overall, and they give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Kareem Hunt has averaged 16.4 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 14.4 rush attempts per game and 3.1 pass targets per game. He scored 19, 8, and 18 fantasy points in the last 3 games, projected at 20.4 fantasy points here in Week 8. He's 6,900 DraftKings salary and 1,300 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks this is going to be a high-scoring game, 55.5 points implied in this game, with the Cleveland Browns favored by 3.5. So you got a fantastic matchup for Kareem Hunt. Odell Beckham Jr. went down last week. He's out for the season, so that should increase the opportunity for the other offensive weapons on the field. So I'm going to start Kareem Hunt here versus the Las Vegas Raiders. Another running back I'm going to start this week is Jonathan Taylor from the Indianapolis Colts playing the Detroit Lions, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, but they give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Jonathan Taylor has averaged 15 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 14.8 rush attempts per game and 2.8 pass targets per game. He scored 16, 15, and 9 fantasy points in the last 3 weeks, projected at 17.7 fantasy points here in Week 8. He's 6,600 DraftKings salary and 700 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 51 points scored in this game, with the Colts favored by 3. Great matchup here, so I'm going to start Jonathan Taylor here versus the Detroit Lions. Another running back I'm going to start is Giovanni Bernard from the Cincinnati Bengals playing the Tennessee Titans, who have the 10th worst defense overall, and they give up the 10th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Giovanni Bernard, he scored 21 fantasy points last week off of 13 rush attempts and 5 pass targets. He took over the backfield for the injured Joe Mixon, and it looks like he's going to get a start again here in Week 8. He's projected at 14.5 fantasy points. He's 5,800 DraftKings salary and 100 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks this is going to be a high-scoring game, 55 points scored in this game, with the Cincinnati Bengals trailing by 4. So I'm going to start Giovanni Bernard here versus the Tennessee Titans.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL, MLB is still going, NBA is right around the corner. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
Okay, who are we going to sit here at the running back position? Now, this is only if you have extra depth at your running back position, or if you're playing DFS, I'd pass on this guy. I'm going to sit Chris Carson from the Seattle Seahawks playing the San Francisco 49ers, who have the 2nd best defense overall, and they give up the absolute fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs. Chris Carson, he's averaging 17.5 fantasy points per game on the season, off an average of 11 rush attempts per game and 4.2 pass targets per game. So he's got low volume, his production has been pretty good, but he only scored 5 fantasy points last week because he was injured in the first quarter. Now, he is projected at 17.3 fantasy points here in Week 8, and he's 6,200 DraftKings salary and 1,400 more on FanDuel. But it looks like he's a little banged up. I don't want to risk him coming out of the game again. It's a terrible matchup, so I'm going to sit Chris Carson here versus the San Francisco 49ers. Okay, let's take a look at the wide receiver position. I'm going to start Tyler Boyd from the Cincinnati Bengals playing the Tennessee Titans, who have the 10th worst defense overall, and they give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Tyler Boyd has averaged 17.3 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 8.7 pass targets per game. He scored 31 fantasy points off of 13 pass targets last game. He's projected at 14.8 fantasy points here in Week 8. He's 6,600 DraftKings salary and 200 less on FanDuel. Vegas thinks this is going to be a high-scoring game. 55 points scored in this game, with the Cincinnati Bengals trailing by 4. So you got a great matchup, a high-scoring game, and a passing game script. So I'm going to start Tyler Boyd here versus the Tennessee Titans. Another wide receiver I'm going to start is Jarvis Landry from the Cleveland Browns playing the Las Vegas Raiders, who have the 6th worst defense overall, and they give up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Jarvis Landry has averaged 10.3 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.6 pass targets per game. He scored 11, 7, and 13 fantasy points in the last 3 games, projected at 10.8 fantasy points here in Week 8. He's 5,600 DraftKings salary and 200 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 55.5 points scored in this game, with the Cleveland Browns favored by 3.5. So you got a great matchup here, a high-scoring game, and Odell Beckham Jr. is out for the season, so Jarvis Landry should get more pass targets, and I think that bumps him up to a starting play here in Week 8. So I'm going to start Jarvis Landry here versus the Las Vegas Raiders. Another wide receiver I'm going to start is Henry Ruggs from the Las Vegas Raiders playing the Cleveland Browns, who have the 7th worst defense overall, and they give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Henry Ruggs has averaged 10.1 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 3.5 pass targets per game. He's projected at 10 fantasy points here in Week 8. He's 4,900 DraftKings salary and 800 more on FanDuel. So we know Vegas thinks this is going to be a high-scoring game. 55.5 points scored in this game, with the Raiders trailing by 3.5. Fantastic matchup here. This guy has big play ability. He's a super fast wide receiver. So I'm going to start Henry Ruggs here versus the Cleveland Browns. Okay, who are we going to sit at the wide receiver position? I'm going to sit Chase Claypool from the Pittsburgh Steelers playing the Baltimore Ravens, who have a good defense overall, and they've been good versus opposing wide receivers. Chase Claypool has averaged 15.4 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 4.2 pass targets per game. But he only scored 1 fantasy point last week off of 1 pass target. He is projected at 13.3 fantasy points here in Week 8, and he's 5,200 DraftKings salary and 800 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 49 points scored in this game, with the Pittsburgh Steelers trailing by 5.5. Now, the Steelers have all their wide receivers healthy again. Deontay Johnson is back. He had a big game last week, so that's going to cut into the opportunity that Chase Claypool has been getting the past few games. He's got a tough matchup here versus Baltimore, so I'm going to sit Chase Claypool here versus the Baltimore Ravens. Okay, moving on to the tight end position. I'm going to start Noah Fant from the Denver Broncos playing the LA Chargers, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they give up the 9th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Noah Fant has averaged 12.3 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.8 pass targets per game. He's projected at 10.4 fantasy points here in Week 8. He's 4,700 DraftKings salary and 1,000 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 44.5 points scored in this game, with the Broncos trailing by 1.5. So you got a pretty good matchup here. Noah Fant took a game off due to injury. He came back last week. He got 7 pass targets, so I like his involvement in the passing game. So I'm going to start Noah Fant here versus the LA Chargers. The other tight end that I'm going to start, despite having a bad couple of weeks, I'm going to start Jonnu Smith from the Tennessee Titans playing the Cincinnati Bengals, who have the 9th worst defense overall, and they give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Jonnu Smith has averaged 12.4 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.5 pass targets per game. Now, the past couple of weeks, he only scored 2 fantasy points off of 4 and 2 pass targets. So some people may be getting frustrated with that lack of production, but this is not the game to sit Jonnu Smith. He's projected at 10.5 fantasy points here in Week 8. He's 4,100 DraftKings salary and 2,000 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks this is going to be a high-scoring game. 55 points scored in this game, with the Tennessee Titans favored by 4. Fantastic matchup here. So I'm going to start Jonnu Smith here versus the Cincinnati Bengals. Okay, who are we going to sit at the tight end position? I'm going to sit Greg Olsen from the Seattle Seahawks playing the San Francisco 49ers, who have the 2nd best defense overall, and they've been pretty good versus opposing tight ends. Greg Olsen has averaged 6.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 3.7 pass targets per game. He's projected at 7.2 fantasy points here in Week 8, and he's 3,600 DraftKings salary and 1,300 more on FanDuel. So not enough pass volume for me the past couple of weeks, and now he's got a bad matchup. So I'm going to sit Greg Olsen here versus the San Francisco 49ers.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NFL slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.